The promise he never forgot. Keanu sat quietly in the back of the studio, the laughter of the crew echoing in the distance. Bright lights surrounded the set, but his thoughts were somewhere else, somewhere far from fame, from cameras, from the noise that defined his world. Sandra Bullock noticed the way he looked down, fingers tracing the edge of a worn notebook he always carried. She had seen that look before, gentle, distant, yet heavy with something unspoken. The director called for a short break. Sandra walked toward him, her steps soft, curious. She leaned forward slightly and smiled. "You okay?" Keanu lifted his gaze slowly. "Yeah, just thinking about someone," he said, his voice calm but fragile. "Someone from your past?" she asked, sitting next to him. He nodded. "Someone who believed in me before I did." Those words lingered in the air like a quiet confession. Sandra didn't push him to explain, but something inside her told her there was a story hidden behind those calm eyes. And she was right. The sound of rain began to tap against the studio windows, soft and rhythmic, almost like it came to accompany his memories. Keanu looked toward it, and his mind slipped back in time, decades earlier, to a cold night in Toronto. He was 12, sitting outside a small apartment building with a cracked window and an old bicycle leaned against the wall. His mother, tired from working 2 jobs, had fallen asleep inside. He stayed out there because it was the only place where he could think, where the noise of life felt a little quieter. He remembered the promise he made to himself that night, that no matter how hard life became, he would never let anger control him. He would never allow pain to make him bitter. He didn't know then that this promise would shape his entire life, guiding him through every loss, every failure, and every act of kindness that would one day define his name. A car passed by, splashing through puddles, and the sound reminded him of something else. A voice. It belonged to a woman named Marie, an elderly neighbor who had seen him sitting there many nights. She used to bring him a cup of warm tea and say, "Keanu, when you feel lost, give kindness a place to rest inside you. It'll always lead you home." Those words became his compass. Even when the world felt cruel, even when he had nothing, he held on to them. Sandra listened quietly as he told her this, her eyes fixed on his, not just as a co-star, but as someone who understood pain in silence. She had her own memories of loss, of quiet battles no one ever saw. "She sounds like someone who saved you," Sandra said softly. Keanu smiled faintly. She did. Not with money, not with fame, but with faith. She believed in goodness when everything around us was falling apart. He paused for a long moment, looking down at his hands. "The night before she passed, she asked me to promise one thing," she said. "When your heart hurts, don't hide it from the world. Let it make you gentle, not cold." His voice cracked slightly on that last word. The room around them was silent, except for the distant hum of equipment. Even the rain seemed to stop, as if listening. Sandra felt her eyes sting, not because the story was sad, but because it was real. It carried that quiet truth that only comes from someone who had lived through loneliness and still chose compassion. Keanu took a deep breath and leaned back. "Sometimes I still hear her voice, especially when I'm tired or unsure. She told me something once that never left me," she said. "The hardest part of love isn't giving it. It's keeping it alive when life tests you." Sandra whispered, "That's beautiful." He smiled gently. It was the first lesson I ever learned about strength. Not the kind that fights back, but the kind that endures. For a moment, they both sat there without speaking. The light flickered slightly as the director called everyone back to set. Sandra wiped a tear before anyone noticed, pretending to adjust her makeup. But inside her, something had shifted. It wasn't just his story, it was the emotion behind it. The raw honesty that made her remember her own childhood. The days when she wanted someone to tell her that kindness still mattered. Later that evening, when the scene was done, she found Keanu again. He was standing alone near the exit door, staring out at the city lights. "You never talk much about your childhood," she said softly. He turned and smiled. "Some stories are hard to tell, not because they're painful, but because they remind you of the people who made you who you are." She looked at him with quiet admiration. Maybe you should tell it someday. People need to hear that kind of strength. He hesitated, his eyes thoughtful. Maybe, he said. But sometimes silence says more than words. Sandra shook her head gently. Not always. Sometimes the right story can heal more than silence ever could. Keanu looked at her for a long time, as if weighing those words. Finally, he said, Maybe you're right. That night, long after everyone left, Keanu opened his notebook and wrote something under the faint glow of a desk lamp. It was a simple line. The story of kindness begins where pain refuses to harden the heart. He didn't know it yet, but this line would become the foundation of something much deeper. A story that would one day move Sandra to tears when she discovered what really happened during his childhood. And as the night grew quiet, he looked out the window and whispered, Thank you, Marie. I'm still keeping the promise. The rain started again, soft and endless, as if the sky itself was listening to the memory of a boy who once chose compassion over despair. The letter she was never meant to read. The next morning, the studio buzzed with its usual energy. Crew members rushed to set up the next scene. Lights flickered on, and the air smelled faintly of coffee and cables. But amid all the motion, Sandra's eyes kept drifting toward Keanu. He seemed calm as always, but there was something different about him today. His gaze stayed fixed on that same old notebook he carried everywhere. He wrote in it before every shoot, during lunch breaks, and even when waiting between scenes. It was like his anchor, something that kept him grounded no matter how chaotic life around him became. Sandra tried not to pry, but curiosity had a way of finding cracks in even the strongest walls. Later that afternoon, when everyone stepped out for lunch, she stayed behind to rehearse a few lines. The studio grew quiet. On the table beside her, Keanu's notebook rested open, forgotten. For a moment, she hesitated. She knew it wasn't right to look, but something inside her whispered that what lay inside wasn't gossip or vanity. It was truth. And truth, she thought, was sacred. Her fingers trembled as she turned the cover gently. Inside, the pages were filled with small, careful handwriting, words that looked like they carried years of pain and reflection. Most of it seemed like notes or personal reminders, but one page caught her eye. It began with 3 words written in faded ink. Dear Marie, thank you. Her heart tightened. It was a letter, a long one, written to the woman Keanu had mentioned the day before. The date in the corner said 1984. She began to read. You told me not to let pain make me cruel. I've tried, Marie. Sometimes it's hard. The world moves fast and people forget kindness like it's something they can't afford anymore. But I still remember the nights you sat outside with me, when I had no one. You said love doesn't disappear, it hides in small acts. I've been trying to find it ever since. Sandra's eyes softened as she read further. You told me one day I'd do something that would make you proud. I don't know if I have yet, but I remember your last words. You said, when you're ready, forgive the man who broke your heart. I wasn't ready then, but maybe now I am. She stopped for a moment, feeling her throat tighten. The letter continued. I found his name in an old envelope. My father's name. I've never met him, but I think I understand him now. Maybe he was lost, maybe afraid. You told me forgiveness isn't about what they deserve. It's about what your soul deserves. I think I'm learning that. Sandra felt something inside her shift. She knew what it meant to forgive someone who never asked for it. Her own life had been full of people who left, of dreams that had to be rebuilt from scratch. She turned the page. The next part was smudged, as if water had touched the paper years ago. When I become someone, I'll build a home for kids who have nowhere to go. I'll name it after you, Marie's house. A place where they'll never have to sit outside in the cold, wondering if kindness is real. She covered her mouth, tears forming quietly in her eyes. She had seen Keanu's public generosity before, his quiet donations, the stories of him giving away most of his earnings to help others. But this was different. This was the root of it all. She closed the notebook slowly, her hands trembling. She wanted to tell him that his promise had already come true, that his entire life had become a reflection of what Marie taught him. But she also knew this letter wasn't meant for her eyes. She sat there for a few moments in silence, breathing slowly, her heart full of emotion she couldn't name. Then she heard footsteps behind her. You found it, Keanu said quietly. Her eyes widened. She turned quickly, guilt flashing across her face. "I'm sorry, I didn't mean to." He shook his head gently. "It's okay." He walked over, his expression calm but unreadable. "You read it, didn't you?" She hesitated. "Just a little. I shouldn't have, but it was beautiful." He smiled faintly, sadness hiding behind it. "I wrote that when I was 15. I didn't even know if I'd ever leave Toronto. I just needed to talk to her one last time." "You never sent it?" she asked softly. "No, she passed away before I could." Sandra felt her chest tighten. "Keanu, I'm so sorry." He looked down, his eyes distant. "I used to think I failed her. I promised I'd make her proud, and then she was gone. But now I think maybe she knew. Maybe she saw something in me that I couldn't see then." Sandra nodded slowly. "She did. And she was right." Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm still trying to live by her words." They stood in silence for a while, the hum of the studio lights filling the air. Finally, Sandra said, "That letter, it made me cry." He looked at her with surprise. "Why?" "Because it reminded me that real strength isn't loud," she said. "It's quiet. It's choosing goodness even when the world gives you every reason not to." Keanu's eyes softened. That's what she believed too. She smiled through her tears. "Then she must have loved you deeply." He nodded. "She did. And sometimes I think her love is still here, guiding me. Every time I see someone in pain, I feel like she's telling me to do something, to be kind, to listen, to help." "You've done more than that," Sandra whispered. "You've turned her lessons into a way of life." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The weight of the story hung gently between them, painful, but peaceful too. Then Keanu took the notebook back and closed it carefully. "There's one more thing she told me before she died," he said quietly. "Something I've never told anyone." Sandra looked at him, her voice soft. "What was it?" He hesitated, his gaze lost in thought. "She said one day, someone would remind me why the promise mattered. Someone who would see through the silence." "I think she meant you." Sandra's breath caught. The world around them seemed to fade for a moment, the studio lights dimming into a soft haze. She didn't know what to say, but her eyes said enough. Keanu smiled gently. "Thank you for reading it. Maybe it was time someone did." As he walked away, the notebook still in his hands, Sandra sat back down, overwhelmed. She realized that sometimes the most beautiful stories are the ones never meant to be shared. But somehow, the universe finds a way to reveal them when the heart is ready. She wiped a tear and whispered to herself, Marie would be proud. Outside, the clouds began to part, and sunlight streamed through the studio window. It fell across the spot where Keanu had been standing, lighting the empty chair beside his notebook. It was as if the universe itself was saying, the promise still lives on. The house built from silence. The days that followed were quiet, but not in a distant way. It was the kind of silence that carried warmth, like two people had started to understand each other beyond words. Sandra couldn't stop thinking about that letter. Every time she saw Keanu smile or help a crew member carry equipment without being asked, she thought of Marie's voice, soft, guiding, unseen, living through him. One evening, after the day's shoot ended, Sandra sat alone in her trailer, scrolling through her phone absent-mindedly. She wasn't looking for anything specific, just reading articles about old charities and foundation projects. Then one headline caught her attention. It read, "The reopening of Marie's house, a shelter for children built on kindness and hope." Her heart stopped. She clicked it. The article showed photos of a modest building near downtown Los Angeles, painted soft white with green vines growing across its entrance. There was a small sign above the gate that read Marie's house. The text below said it had been founded 15 years earlier by an anonymous donor who requested not to be named. But one of the pictures showed something that made her eyes fill with tears. On the wall near the garden, in small engraved letters, it said, "For the woman who taught me that love never leaves, it just changes form." She didn't need to guess who had written that. She stared at the screen for a long time. The article said the shelter provided food, education, and therapy for children who had been abandoned or lost their parents. Many volunteers described the place as unlike any other. One wrote, "You can feel peace here, like the walls remember kindness." Sandra closed her eyes. It was him. He had built it. He had already fulfilled his promise to Marie, silently, without telling anyone, not even his closest friends. Her throat tightened. She imagined him writing that letter at 15, vowing to build a home someday. And now, years later, he had done it quietly, without fame or recognition. She grabbed her coat and keys. Within an hour, she was standing outside Marie's house. The sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of amber and gold. Children were playing near the garden, their laughter echoing through the evening air. A few caretakers were tidying up the entrance. Sandra walked closer, her eyes wide, her heart pounding. A young woman near the gate greeted her. "Hi, can I help you?" "I just wanted to visit," Sandra said softly. "I heard about this place," the woman smiled. "It's special, isn't it?" The man who built it never wanted credit. "We only know his first name, Keanu. He used to visit sometimes late at night to drop off books or gifts for the kids. He'd never stay long," Sandra's breath caught. "He came here himself?" "Yeah," the woman said. "Once I saw him sit with one of the boys who wouldn't talk to anyone. They just sat there side by side for an hour. No words, just quiet. And when he left, the boy started speaking again the next day." Sandra felt tears rise again. She walked slowly through the garden. The evening breeze carried the scent of flowers and rain-soaked soil. She saw drawings taped to the walls, crayons, hearts, smiling suns. One drawing showed a tall man with a beard holding hands with a group of children. The words beneath it read, "Mr. K, the man with the calm eyes." She smiled through tears. That was him. She walked around the corner where a small bench stood under a tree. Carved into the wood were faint letters. "Kindness never dies." She sat there, imagining Keanu sitting in the same spot. She could almost see him. Quiet, thoughtful, maybe holding a book, watching the children laugh, remembering Marie. A soft voice broke her thoughts. "You're Sandra Bullock, right?" She turned. An older woman stood nearby holding a watering can. Her hair was silver and her eyes were full of warmth. "Yes," Sandra said gently. "I just came to see this place." The woman smiled knowingly. "He talks about you sometimes." Sandra blinked, surprised. "Keanu?" The woman nodded. "He comes here once in a while. Not as often now, but when he does, he always speaks about his friend Sandra. He says you remind him of someone from his past, someone who helped him believe again." Sandra felt her heart swell. "He never told me about this place." "That's how he is," the woman said softly. "Quiet kindness. He doesn't do things to be seen. He does them because they keep a promise alive." Sandra looked at the children again. "He built all of this because of someone named Marie." The woman smiled sadly. "Yes, he told us. Sometimes he sits right there under that tree and talks about her. He says she saved him once, and he's been trying to return the favor to the world ever since." The words hit Sandra like a wave of emotion. Her eyes filled again, and she whispered, "She must have been someone very special." The woman nodded. She was. But so is he. As Sandra left Marie's house that night, the city lights shimmered like stars fallen to earth. She looked back one last time, her heart heavy but warm. She could feel Marie's presence there, soft, eternal, woven into the laughter of every child in that home. Later, she called Keanu. He answered quietly. "Hey, Sandra, I went to Marie's house," she said, her voice trembling. There was silence on the other end. Then a small sigh. "I thought you might. Why didn't you tell anyone?" she asked gently. He paused for a long moment. "Because it wasn't mine to tell. It was hers." Sandra closed her eyes, holding back tears. "But you made it real. You made her dream live again." "Maybe," he said softly. "But I think she made me who I am first. I just gave it back." "Keanu," she whispered. "That's the most beautiful thing I've ever heard." He chuckled faintly. "You're crying again, aren't you?" She smiled through her tears. "Maybe," his voice softened. "Don't cry. She'd want you to smile." There was a pause, long and peaceful. Then Sandra said quietly, "You know, she was right." "About what?" "About someone reminding you why the promise mattered." The line went quiet. Then, slowly, he said, "Yeah." Maybe she was. They didn't say goodbye for a long time. They just stayed on the call, silent but connected, listening to the hum of the city behind them. It was as if Marie herself was somewhere in that silence, smiling, proud, watching two souls keep her lesson alive. As Sandra ended the call, she looked out the window. The sky was dark, but one star shone brighter than the rest. She whispered to it, "Thank you, Marie." He kept the promise. And far away, Keanu sat by his window too, staring at the same sky, feeling that same quiet peace. For the first time in years, he didn't feel alone in keeping that promise. The photograph in the Attica a week later, the film wrapped its final scene. Applause filled the studio as cameras shut down. Crew members cheered and everyone began to celebrate the end of months of work. Sandra smiled and clapped with the others, but inside, her thoughts were still somewhere else. Ever since visiting Marie's house, she couldn't stop thinking about Keanu's story. There was something about it, something unfinished, like a melody that paused before its last note. That evening, while everyone gathered at the farewell dinner, Sandra noticed Keanu sitting quietly at the edge of the table. The lights from the restaurant cast a soft glow on his face. He looked peaceful but distant, his mind clearly somewhere beyond the room. After a while, she leaned closer and asked, "Do you ever go back to where you grew up?" He smiled faintly. "Sometimes. Not often. Too many ghosts there." She nodded, understanding. "You ever visit Marie's old place?" He looked surprised. "You know about that?" "A little," she said softly. "I wanted to see where it all began." Keanu stared at his drink for a moment, then said, "It's still standing. The building's falling apart, but I couldn't bring myself to let them tear it down. I visit once a year just to remember." Sandra placed her hand gently on his arm. "Next time you go, I'd like to come with you." He looked at her, silent for a few seconds, then nodded. "Okay." 2 days later, they drove together through the quiet streets of Toronto. It was early morning, the kind of calm that makes every sound feel sacred. As they turned a corner, Keanu slowed down and pointed. "That's it," he said softly. The building was small and worn, with peeling paint and broken steps. But the garden was still there, overgrown yet alive, full of wildflowers. Sandra stepped out of the car and felt a strange wave of emotion. She could almost imagine a younger Keanu sitting there, knees tucked to his chest, staring up at the same sky. Inside, the rooms were dusty but full of echoes. Old furniture, faded wallpaper, a cracked mirror on the wall. It was like stepping into a memory that had been waiting for someone to return. Keanu walked to the small living room and touched the wall gently. "She used to hang photos here," he said quietly. "She loved taking pictures even though her camera barely worked." Sandra smiled softly. "Do you still have any of them?" "A few," he said. "Most got lost when the place flooded years ago." They walked upstairs together. The air smelled of dust and old rain. One door creaked open, revealing a small attic filled with boxes. Cobwebs hung from the ceiling beams, and sunlight streamed through a cracked window, catching the dust in golden particles. Sandra brushed her hand across one of the boxes. "Mind if I look?" Keanu nodded. "Go ahead." She opened a box filled with old letters, small trinkets, and faded photographs. Most of the photos showed Marie in her younger years, smiling with neighbors, standing in gardens, surrounded by children. But one photograph caught her eye. It was older, slightly torn at the edge. It showed Marie sitting on a park bench with a man beside her, a man who looked strikingly familiar. She looked closer, her heart pounding. "Keanu," she whispered. "Come here." He walked over. She handed him the photograph, his brow furrowed. He leaned in, his eyes narrowing as if trying to make sense of what he saw. "That's my mother," he said slowly. Sandra's heart skipped. "What?" "Look," he said, pointing to the man in the picture. "That's her, when she was young. I've seen that same necklace in every photo of her. And the man beside Marie, that's my father." Sandra froze. "Your parents knew Marie?" He stared at the photo, disbelief in his voice. "I had no idea. My mother never mentioned her. And my father? He left before I was born." They stood in silence, the air heavy with shock. Sandra whispered, What if Marie wasn't just your neighbor, Keanu? What if she was something more? He looked down at the picture again, his voice trembling slightly. Maybe she knew them before I was born. Maybe that's why she cared so much about me. Maybe she felt like she had to protect me. He turned the photograph over. On the back, written in faded blue ink, were the words, "For the child who will one day need both our hearts." Sandra covered her mouth, tears filling her eyes. Keanu, this means she knew you before you even existed. He sat down slowly, the floor creaking beneath him. It's like she knew what was coming, like she promised them she'd look after me. For a long time, neither of them spoke. The only sound was the soft whisper of the wind through the broken window. Finally, Keanu said, I always wondered why she cared for me like she did. I wasn't her family, but now, maybe I was. Sandra knelt beside him. She might have been the bridge between you and your parents. Maybe she was the reason you survived all of it. He nodded slowly, his voice breaking. She was the only one who ever made me feel like I wasn't alone. He looked at the photograph again, his hands trembling slightly. This changes everything. Sandra placed a hand on his shoulder. No, Keanu. It doesn't change who she was to you. It just makes her love even deeper. He smiled faintly through tears. You're right. She was family even if I didn't know it. They spent hours cleaning the attic, collecting the letters and photographs. Each box felt like uncovering a forgotten piece of his past. Among the papers, Sandra found one envelope addressed in Marie's handwriting, but never sent. It read, To my dearest Keanu, when you are grown, remember what was promised before you were born. She handed it to him. He stared at it for a long time before whispering, I can't open it. Not yet? Why not? She asked softly. Because some things are meant to be understood at the right time, he said. And maybe that time hasn't come yet. Sandra nodded. Then I'll keep it safe for you. He smiled. Thank you. As they left the house, the sun began to set behind the rooftops, casting the old building in warm golden light. Keanu turned back one last time, his voice barely above a whisper. She kept her promise, he said. Even before I was born. Sandra looked at him, her heart full. And you kept yours too. As they drove away, the photograph lay between them on the dashboard, a silent witness to a truth hidden for decades. Both of them knew that this discovery wasn't the end. It was only the beginning of another secret Marie had left behind. Because, somewhere inside that unopened envelope, lay the truth about what she had promised his parents and why she had chosen him. The letter he feared to open, the photograph haunted Keanu for days. Even after returning to Los Angeles, he couldn't stop thinking about it. Marie's smiling face beside his young parents wasn't just a coincidence. It was a link he had never known existed. And that unopened envelope? It felt heavier than paper should. It sat on his desk, pale and quiet, sealed with age. Sandra had kept it safe, just as she promised. But when she handed it back to him that evening, she said softly, It's time, Keanu. Whatever's inside you deserve to know. He looked at her, eyes clouded with uncertainty. What if it changes everything? Then let it, she said gently. Truth doesn't destroy real love, it deepens it. He nodded slowly, but his hands trembled as he picked up the envelope. They sat together in his apartment, the only light coming from the warm glow of a single lamp. Outside, rain tapped gently against the window, just like it did the night Marie once brought him tea all those years ago. For a long moment, he simply stared at the letter. Then, with a deep breath, he tore it open. The paper inside was thin, delicate, and written in the same graceful handwriting that once filled his childhood notebooks. He began to read aloud, his voice barely above a whisper. My dear Keanu, if you are reading this, it means you have grown into the man I hoped you would become. I wanted to tell you something long ago, but life and fear kept me silent. You deserve to know the truth before I am gone. Keanu's breath caught, and his fingers tightened on the paper. Your mother and I were best friends. We met when we were young, long before you were born. She was full of laughter, full of light. When she married your father, I was her maid of honor. I watched their love grow, but I also saw how fragile it was beneath the surface. Your father struggled with himself, with guilt, with dreams he could not hold on to. When he left, it broke her, and I promised her one thing. that I would look after you if she ever couldn't. Sandra's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and touched his arm gently, but he kept reading. I was there the night you were born. She held you in her arms and whispered, if anything happens to me, Marie will be his guardian angel. I didn't know that night how literal her words would become. Keanu's voice cracked, but he continued, unable to stop. A few years later, she fell ill. She didn't tell anyone until it was too late. Before she passed, she asked me again to keep my promise. She said, make sure he never grows bitter, even if the world forgets him. I promised her that I would. I told her I would raise you to know love, not through comfort, but through compassion. Tears ran down Keanu's face now. Silent and steady, Sandra whispered softly. She made you her life's promise. He nodded, barely able to speak. She did, he kept reading, his voice shaking. I never told you because I didn't want you to feel like you owed me anything. Love given from duty loses its light. I wanted you to find it on your own, and you did. You gave it back to the world in ways even I could not imagine. He stopped, wiping his eyes, but forced himself to finish. When you see this letter, go to the garden. You'll find something buried under the small oak tree, the same one you used to sit under when you were 12. It's my last gift to you. Not money, not gold, but a piece of truth that might help you forgive. The letter ended there. No signature, just a small pressed flower taped to the bottom. It was old, fragile, yet still faintly pink. Keanu placed the letter down and sat in silence. The sound of the rain filled the room again. Sandra finally spoke. Do you know what she meant? What's under the oak tree? He nodded faintly. There's only one way to find out. The next morning they flew back to Toronto. The air was cold and the ground wet with dew. When they arrived at the old house, the garden looked the same. Wildflowers everywhere, soft grass beneath the old oak tree. Keanu knelt down with a small shovel. He began to dig where the roots spread, careful and quiet, like a man uncovering sacred ground. After a few minutes, the shovel hit something solid. He brushed away the dirt and found a small wooden box, worn and cracked from years of weather. He lifted it out gently, his hands trembling. This is it, he whispered. Sandra knelt beside him. Open it. Inside the box was a stack of letters tied with ribbon and a small photograph. The photograph showed Marie, his mother, and a baby, him. They were all together, smiling under the same oak tree. Keanu's eyes widened. This was here all along. Beneath the photo was another letter written in the same hand. My dear boy, this is the day your mother brought you to me. She told me that no matter how far you go, the world will always test your heart. She said, when he grows older, tell him that pain is not punishment. It's the proof that he can still love. Keanu pressed the letter against his chest. His whole body trembled as he whispered, she was there the day my mother died. She must have stayed until the end. Sandra put her arm around him, and she never stopped keeping her promise. He nodded, tears streaming down his face. She gave me more than life. She gave me the reason to live it kindly. They sat there for a long time, the wind moving softly through the trees. Sunlight filtered through the leaves, casting shifting gold across the old letters. Finally, Sandra said quietly, what will you do with them? Keanu smiled faintly through his tears. I'll put them where they belong, at Marie's house. Those kids should know where kindness began. Sandra's eyes glistened. That's beautiful. He stood slowly, still holding the photo of Marie and his mother. Maybe this was what she wanted me to find. Not just my past, but the peace inside it. As they walked away, he turned one last time to look at the tree. The sunlight flickered through its branches, and for a brief moment, he thought he saw her there, Marie, standing in the glow, smiling softly, like she'd been waiting all this time for him to finally understand. He whispered, thank you. And in that quiet moment, the wind answered, carrying the scent of wildflowers across the garden. Gentle, familiar, eternal. The promise fulfilled. A few weeks passed before Keanu was ready to return to Marie's house. He wanted to go alone, but Sandra insisted on coming with him. She told him some journeys were too heavy to walk through without a friend beside you. He didn't argue. They arrived in the evening, just as the sky was painted with the colors of fading sunlight: amber, rose, and quiet gold. The children were playing near the garden, their laughter mixing with the soft chirping of crickets. The old woman who managed the shelter smiled when she saw them. "He's back," she said warmly. "The kids will be happy." Keanu smiled faintly. "I'm not here to stay long. I just came to bring something home." They walked through the small courtyard until they reached the oak tree at the center of the garden, the same kind that grew behind Marie's house, planted from the seeds he had brought years ago. He knelt down and placed the wooden box near its roots. Sandra watched quietly as he opened it. Inside were Marie's letters, the old photograph of her with his mother, and a single folded page from the letter he had found in the attic. He took a deep breath and began to speak softly, his voice steady but full of emotion. "Marie," he whispered, "you said love doesn't disappear, it just changes form. I believe that now. I see it in every face here, in every laugh, in every small act of kindness. You kept your promise to my mother, and now I'm keeping mine to you." He placed the letters gently into the soil and covered them with earth, pressing his palm against the ground like a blessing. "You once said that pain doesn't have to make us cruel," he continued, his eyes glistening. "You were right. It can make us kind, if we let it." The children nearby had grown silent, watching him curiously, as if they could sense that something sacred was happening. One small girl stepped forward and asked softly, "Mr. Keanu, are you planting something?" He smiled through his tears. "Yes, sweetheart. I'm planting a promise." She nodded seriously as if she understood, then took a small white flower from her hair and placed it in the soil beside the box. "So it will grow," she said. Keanu's chest tightened. "Thank you," he whispered. Sandra stepped beside him, her own eyes red. "She'd be proud of you," she said. He looked up at the sky, where the last light of the sun lingered behind clouds. "I think she already is." They sat together on the bench under the tree as night began to fall. The children returned to their games, laughter floating through the twilight. The house glowed softly from inside, golden light spilling through the windows. It felt like Marie's presence was everywhere, warm, unseen, but deeply alive. After a long silence, Sandra spoke quietly. "You know, there's something about this place. It doesn't feel like a shelter. It feels like a heart." Keanu smiled gently. "That's what it was meant to be. Not a place of sadness, but of beginning." "You gave it that," she said. He shook his head softly. "No, she did. I just kept it alive." The wind rustled through the oak leaves and he closed his eyes. For the first time in years, he felt something lift from him, the quiet weight of unfinished grief. He didn't need to hold it anymore. He finally understood that love wasn't meant to stay trapped in memory. It was meant to keep moving, to keep healing. After a while, Sandra stood and said, "Come on, let's go inside. I want to see the wall with the children's drawings again." They walked in together. The hall smelled faintly of soap, fresh bread, and flowers. Laughter echoed from down the corridor. As they turned a corner, Sandra stopped. A new frame had been added to the wall. It was a photo of the oak tree, freshly covered soil beneath it, with the small girl's white flower blooming on top. Beneath it, someone had written in neat handwriting, "Planted by Mr. Keanu, in memory of Marie and the mother who gave him his heart." Sandra touched the frame gently. "Did you write this?" Keanu shook his head. "No, someone must have seen us." They stood there for a while, smiling through tears. The children passed by, giggling, chasing each other, and one of them called out, "Good night, Mr. Keanu." He waved, smiling. "Good night, little one." Sandra turned to him. "Do you ever think about how one act of kindness can last a lifetime?" He looked around the room, the children, the caretakers, the soft lights, the peace that lived in the walls. "It's more than a lifetime," he said. "It's forever." As they stepped outside again, the stars had begun to appear. The night air was cool and calm. Sandra looked at him with quiet admiration. "You know, Keanu," she said softly, "I've seen you play so many roles, heroes, wanderers, men who fight against darkness. But I think this is who you really are. Not the actor, not the star. Just the man who kept his promise. He smiled at her, eyes gentle and sincere. Maybe that's all I ever wanted to be. They walked slowly toward the car, but before getting in, Keanu stopped and looked back one last time. The oak tree stood tall, its leaves whispering softly in the night breeze. He closed his eyes, and for a moment, he heard her voice again. Marie's soft, warm tone, the same one from his childhood. "You did well, my boy. You kept your heart open," he smiled, his eyes glistening. "Thank you, Marie," he whispered, "for everything." Sandra stood beside him, placing her hand gently over his. "You ready?" He nodded. "Yeah, I think I finally am." As they drove away, the camera of life seemed to pull back. The oak tree glowing faintly under the moonlight, the laughter of children echoing through the night, the small white flower still blooming in the soil where promises rested. And in that gentle silence, two souls, one living, one remembered, were finally at peace.